Cider Industries is sponsoring this today. We're delighted to do Dave Weaver Zerker as our speaker. And by the way, Alice Zerker, Dave's mother. Alice, would you mind standing so we can recognize you? We're so glad to have you here. And I'm going to make my part very, very brief. David actually said if you have bad things to say, keep it really short. If you have good things, you can go as long as you want. He really didn't say that. He thought it. But I do want you guys to know that David Weaver Zerker is really one of the top scholars in the world in Amish studies. Just to give you an indication, here's some books that David has published. The Amish Way, Patient Faith in a Perilous World. Here's another one. The Amish in the American Imagination. Hey there. Here's another one. Amish Grace, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy. Here's another one. The Amish in the Media. Here's another one. Minding the Church, Scholarship in the Anabaptist Tradition. And here's another one. Writing the Amish, the words of John A. Hostet. It just goes on and on. And he really is one of the top people. So David is going to speak today on Amish behaving badly, Amish realities and Amish reality shows. He told me he's going to run this speech. We'll run his presentation speech, a very informal presentation. We'll run about 45 to 50 minutes. And then there'll be plenty of time for you to engage David, ask questions, you can throw rotten eggs if you want, whatever you want to do. But David assured me that we'll get out of here at 5:15 sharp. Okay, David, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, everybody, for coming, especially my mom. Some of those books sold one copy, and she bought them, so that's nice to have her here today. I figured a topic or a title like Amish behaving badly would get a good turnout. People like oxymorons, those words that don't go together. So if I ever start a sports bar, it's going to be called the Puritan Sports Bar. And this kind of fits into that. The difference, though, is that Amish oxymorons sell. And you may be aware of some of those. The Amish Mafia reality show that at least some of you have watched, at least some of. There's the Amish Outlaws. It's a nightclub act at the Hollywood Casino, so Richard Hughes sees them a lot, I guess. Is that? And don't forget the Electric Amish. A faux Amish band that cut its album Barn to be Wild nearly 20 years ago. These acts feature characters like Lebanon Levi, that's the Amish Mafia guy, Ishmael LL Cool J, and Graber Goodman is in the Electric Amish, and he looks a lot like Dusty Hill from ZZ Top, I noticed. That's Dusty Hill at the bottom right, and Graber Goodman at the top on the right. These all play off the idea that the Amish are a chaste and very law-abiding culture that's entirely unplugged. And what can be more fun than imagining that this sort of society is rife with gun-toting, law-breaking, guitar-playing, bar-hopping frat boys? Of course, our irony-loving imagination sometimes merges into reality. And so Puritans actually did drink beer, even though we don't think of that. And there are a lot of real-life examples of Amish behaving badly. So let me begin just with this example. It's an old one. In 1998, there were two Lancaster County Amish men, both in their early 20s, who were arrested for selling cocaine. Their suppliers were a gang of bikers that went by the name the Pagans. And their intended buyers were Amish teenagers. Both men's name was Abner Stoltzfus. That only added some deliciousness to the story, so every major news outlet picked it up. David Letterman was quick to make some hay. Among his top 10 signs that your Amish teen is in trouble, Letterman included, his name is Jebediah, but he goes by Jeb Daddy. Now, I like that joke. In part because I've never met an Amish man, past or present, named Jebediah. And if you don't get anything else from my talk today, you can leave with this one depressing and entirely useless fact. there are more Amish girls named Caitlin than there are Amish men named Jebediah. Isn't that disappointing? I think that's disappointing. Okay, back to the drug bust story. Here's a picture that appeared in one of the local news magazines. The bikers asked him, can he speak Deutsch and speak Dutch? And the Amishman saying, hey, awesome, dude. Had our Amish drug dealers been Methodists, I can assure you that the New Yorker never would have picked up the story. But Abner and Abner weren't Methodists, they were Amish. Or were they? They hadn't been baptized into the Amish church, which in the Amish world is the true mark of whether one is actually Amish or not. Indeed, the chief complaint among the Amish people as they looked at the media coverage of this story was the fact that the media didn't pay any attention to that fact, that they weren't baptized, a detail that the Amish thought was the most important detail to mention. So we'll come back to that question a couple times this afternoon. The question of who counts as Amish and who doesn't count as Amish. But first, let me give you the big picture. The first half of my talk this afternoon, I'm going to talk about some beard and hair cuttings in Ohio, some real-life Amish behaving badly. And in the second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about some of these reality shows. In some ways, they don't have much to do with one another, but sometimes what happens in real life bleeds over to things that come up in some of these reality shows. And so I'll try to make some of the connections along the way. So first, I'll talk about these beard cuttings that took place in Ohio. And my first opening screen had those three men in the orange jumpsuits. Those were three of the men that were involved in this. In fall of 2001, in a span of about 2 months, 7 men, Amish men and women, had their beards or their hair forcibly cut by people from a small Amish community, or some people would prefer I say Amish-like community, not really an Amish community, near Burkholtz, Ohio. And here's a picture of the 16 people that were charged with that crime. You can see that most of them were men, although some of the people that went along were women. The beard cutters performed these acts in 2 ways. In some cases, they traveled to their victims' homes under the cover of night. They knocked on the door, and once they were invited in, they attacked their hosts. In other cases, they invited Amish acquaintances, or in some cases, family members, to Burkholtz, their community. And in the course of their victims' visits, forcibly cut their beards. In some cases, the beard cutters knew their victims personally. In 2 different cases, the victims were actually parents of their attackers, the people that were cutting their beards or their hair. In other cases, the beard cutters knew their victims hardly at all. In some cases, they knew them only by reputation. Now, there are lots of details about this event that prove the adage that reality is stranger than fiction. Or we could say reality is stranger than Amish reality shows. On one occasion, the beard cutters and their accomplices, 27 people in all, traveled to their victim's home in a horse trailer pulled by a pickup truck. Now, this isn't the actual horse trailer and the actual pickup truck, but I wanted you to see what a horse trailer was. Rich, I don't think that horse is Amish, am I right?
Looks pretty good.
At least he hasn't joined the church yet. I do know that's the case. But anyway, it was this sort of vehicle, 27 people in the back going to cut other people's hair. In one case, they collected the hair and they took it back to Burkholtz, where they laid it out on the kitchen table in front of everyone like a prized scalp. And perhaps most amazing of all, they took along a disposable camera to take a few pictures. Later, when one young man was told to dispose of the camera, he put it in a plastic bag and he hid it in the woods, where the FBI found it, thus providing evidence for the prosecution. And this is one of the pictures that they took while they were engaged in this act at one of the homes. Now, there's no easy way to summarize all the factors that fueled the beard cutters' actions, but the fact that it entailed cutting people's hair shows what they wanted their victims to feel. Hair, whether it be women's hair or men's beards, has religious significance in Amish life. It's a sign of Christian faithfulness. Amish women grow their hair long in response to Paul's admonition in 1 Corinthians 11 that it's disgraceful for a woman to cut her hair. The biblical rationale for growing beards is less clear, but Amish tradition holds that men should grow beards when they marry. Some Amish men compare it to a wedding ring, only it's a wedding ring that you can't take off and put back on at your convenience. In both cases, hair symbolizes faithfulness to the church and therefore faithfulness to God. As a good Amish church member, you wouldn't dream of cutting off your beard or your hair as an adult man or woman. And to have it forcibly cut off by someone else would be humiliating. The fact that the attackers went after the people's hair hints at a religious motive for what they did, though it doesn't necessarily prove it, at least in a way that would satisfy a jury. And here we see some of the Burkholtz men in court. But that's what the prosecutors wanted to prove. They wanted to prove that this was a religiously motivated attack. As some of you may know, this was tried in federal court as a hate crime. It could have been tried in a local court or state court by local authorities as simple assault, which would have been an easy conviction because there was no question that this had happened and no one denied that they did it. But it also would have meant that the attackers would have served little, if any, jail time. And the authorities, the legal authorities, wanted longer sentences. And to do that, they needed to establish that the attackers were religiously motivated in what they did. And because the main leader didn't participate in the actual attacks, the prosecutors needed to establish that there was a conspiracy, that he was somehow involved in the planning or the encouragement of what was carried out. And that brings us to a man named Sam Mullet, although not quite. Because to understand Mullet's role, the leader of this community and the whole thing, we first need to think a little bit about Amish life and the way Amish life is organized. Three terms will be helpful here in understanding how Amish life is organized: settlement, district, and affiliation. So I'm going to say a little bit about these three words. What's a settlement? A settlement is a geographical area that contains one or more Amish congregations. Sometimes settlements carry county names, like the Lancaster County Settlement. Sometimes they carry town names, like in northern Indiana, the Napanee Settlement. A settlement might just contain one Amish congregation, or it might contain dozens. Lancaster County Settlement contains almost 200 districts, congregations in the settlement. Now, what is a district? A district is an Amish congregation of 20 to 30 families who live near one another and who worship together regularly. Here's what a district might look like. And again, a settlement might just have one district. It might have a couple hundred. District looks something like this. And you can see on this scheme, the square, the dark squares are Amish homes or houses or farms. The white circles are non-Amish families or homes. And you can see that they're interspersed along a county road. This district, which is hypothetical, has boundaries. There's a highway at the bottom of the district. There's a township line on one side. It's a stream on the other. On the north side, maybe a county line or another road. But a district is geographically bounded, and it consists of Amish families, people that are close enough to get together regularly through horse and buggy transportation to worship. And as many of you know, this worship happens in these homes. They'll move around. It'll be in one home one Sunday, and 2 weeks later it'll be in another home or another barn. So that's a district. What's an affiliation? Again, a settlement contains one or more of these districts. District 20 or 30 families that worship together. An affiliation, at least one way to think about it, is a network of like-minded districts that are similar to one another in practice. And in Amish life, there's a lot of diversity. We may not see it from the outside, but there's a lot of diversity, and some Amish are very like-minded in their practice and are different in that way from another group of Amish. So we might think about this network, this affiliation, something like a denomination, like the Brethren in Christ Church or like the Methodist Church. But it's different in the sense that there's no overall leadership structure, there's no headquarters, there's no mailing address. It's much less formal. There may not even be regular meetings among ministers in an affiliation of Amish churches. They may get together occasionally, but there's no regular planned meetings of ministers in an affiliation. Affiliations are basically churches that look at other churches and say, we do Amish life like they do Amish life. We have enough in common that we can cooperate, that we can exchange ministers, and maybe have our children marry one another. There's those sort of more informal understandings. Now, what does this have to do with Burkholz and the district where these beard cutters came from? Burkholz is a one-district settlement that is largely unaffiliated. And so again, a settlement is just the geographical area. There's just one district in this area. It's this Burkholz church. And it's largely unaffiliated, has loose ties with perhaps one other Amish church district in western Pennsylvania. But it's a one-district settlement that's largely unaffiliated. Let me explain by way of history. The Burkholz community came into existence in 1995 when a 50-year-old Amish man named Sam Mullet and much of his family moved there from Fredericktown, Ohio. And this arrow gives you a sense of where the Burkholz community is. If you travel about 100 miles straight west in Ohio, you can see where Sam Mullet and his family lived before they moved to Burkholz. Amish people start settlements for all sorts of reasons. Often it's economic reasons. You might be looking for cheaper farmland from where you live, or it's getting crowded and you want to move. But Amish people also start new settlements for religious reasons. When families, for example, are unhappy with certain things about the district, maybe the district is becoming too liberal in some ways, and they're not comfortable having their children in that district, they may decide we're going to move and start a new settlement somewhere else where we can have our own church. Most new settlements begin when a few families make the move together. In the case of Burkholz, however, the situation was different. The beginning of Burkholz was largely the Mullet family making the move on their own. Though making this move on their own was numerically significant, since Sam Mullet and his wife Wilma had 18 children. And they would eventually have 80-plus grandchildren. 13 of those 18 children would move to Burkholz with Sam and his wife Wilma. Some moved as single people, others were already married, and so they moved with spouses and children. So this was not so much a group of Amish families starting a new settlement. This was more a patriarch moving his clan. Not surprisingly, the Burkholz district didn't look like the Amish district I showed you earlier, with Amish people interspersed in their own homes, with English neighbors interspersed in between. Rather, Sam Mullet bought 800 acres of land on which sat a large farmhouse. And this is Sam standing in front of that farmhouse. The farmhouse was the clear center of Burkholz community life. Some of Mullet's married children actually lived in this farmhouse. And over time, some of the older grandsons lived in his barn. Still other people built homes on his 800-acre property. So Mullet the patriarch was also Mullet the landlord. And in many ways, the Burkholz settlement was more like a compound than it was like a district. Before long, the patriarch and the landlord was also the bishop, the chief religious leader in the Burkholz community who preached, who baptized people, who married people, who oversaw church discipline. In Ohio Amish life, each district has two ministers, or will eventually have two ministers. And once there are three ministers, one of them becomes the bishop. So that eventually each district in Ohio has a bishop and then two other ministers, the bishop being the leader and then 2 other ministers that are his associates. Sam Mullet became the first minister in Berkholtz in 1997, 2 years after the Klan had moved to Berkholtz. 4 years later, in 2001, after Sam's son, Johnny, and another man had become minister, Sam became the bishop. As some of you know, becoming a minister or becoming a bishop in Amish life happens in a rather unique way, in that all ministers and all bishops are chosen by lot. It's not a pure democratic election where a board gets together and maybe decides this is going to be our minister, or where people simply vote. Rather, church members nominate male members for the position, and once the nominations have been tallied, the men who received a certain number of nominations, sometimes it's 2 or maybe 3, are placed into the lot. This means that the nominees for minister or bishop, in the context of the ordination service, are to choose a hymnal from a row or a stack of hymnals, one of which contains a piece of paper. If you're the nominee that happens to choose the hymnal with the slip in it, you're now the minister, and you are the minister for life. From the Amish perspective, this has nothing at all to do with chance. It's God's work. The minister has been chosen by God. So the people have participated, they've nominated, but ultimately God has chosen the man, and it is always a man, as the minister, a providential selection. Now, if you're like me, it's easy to be skeptical of Mullet's ordination to minister and then to bishop. I wonder if maybe he was the only person who was nominated, which would be quite unusual in Amish life if there's just one person nominated. It could be that his selection was on the up and up, but there is a fact that we know was out of the ordinary about his ordination as bishop. And it's this: there was only one other Amish bishop who attended his ordination. Something that David Luthi, an Amish historian in Ontario, says is absolutely unique in Amish life, that there was only one other visiting bishop there. When new Amish districts come into existence that have no ordained ministers, these districts need guidance. And in most cases, a visiting bishop will provide that guidance until the district is ready to ordain a minister, and then the bishop will help to supervise that ordination to make sure it happens appropriately. And the same goes for the ordination of a bishop. Though in the case of ordaining a bishop, multiple bishops show up and participate in the process, ultimately laying their hands on the new bishop to signify God's approval. In the Amish world, Amish bishops, though they are the leaders of a district, are not to be lone rangers. At Mullet's ordination, however, only one other bishop was there, and he himself was something of a lone ranger in that his district was unaffiliated. Now, this in itself was enough to make the Amish world skeptical of Sam Mullet, but soon there were reports of other things that Mullet was doing or practices that the whole community was instituting that made other Ohio Amish people nervous. These things included kind of a variety of things. One was that the Amish women in Berkholtz began to wear scarves instead of bonnets. And you can see the Berkholtz woman there on the right and how different her head covering is from the one the woman is wearing on the left, which is much, much more common among Amish in Ohio. Another thing, they abandoned Sunday morning church meetings for a time in favor of just meeting together on Wednesday evening and then later meeting together on Sunday evening. Again, something very unique in Amish life. Even more strange were a number of self-disciplinary practices that they engaged in that have that show up nowhere in Amish history. In some cases, the men would cut their beards as a self-disciplining practice. For example, if they were engaging in what they would think of as immoral thoughts, this was a self-disciplinary practice that they would engage in. There was also a chicken coop on Sam Mullet's property that became what they called their Amish jail for people to live in during a time of self-reflection and discipline. And according to testimony at the beard cutting trial, Mullet also engaged in private marriage counseling with women in the community, instructing them on how to be more sexually pleasing to their husbands, and according to some testimony at the trial, letting them practice that with him. Amish behaving badly, right? As early as 2005, when some of these practices began to appear, some people within the Burkholz community that were there with Mullet, sometimes relatives or people that had moved in later, began to find things troubling, including what they felt was a very iron-fisted leadership style by Sam Mullet. They questioned his leadership. Some threatened to leave. Some, in fact, did leave. They moved back to their home community from where they had come. At least that was what they planned to do. And that may have been the end of it. But in Amish life, at least in the Amish world that Burkholz moved in, it's very hard just to walk away. In Amish life, and particularly at Burkholz, if you challenge the authority of the bishop and the ministers, there's a chance that you will be disciplined by the church for being out of line, a process that the bishop oversees. And that's exactly what Mullet did to some of his disenchanted members. He excommunicated them. That is, he removed them from the Burkholz church membership. And this is where the story gets somewhat interesting. From our perspective, we might say, big deal. Who cares if an Amish minister disciplines you, especially if you're moving away? But in the segment of the Amish world that Burkholz members participated in, that is, in the places that they wanted to return to when they were leaving Burkholz, you're not allowed just to walk away and join up with another church. These disenchanted Burkholz members had originally come from what are called strict shunning churches. To be a strict shunning church means you cannot take in an excommunicated Amish person into membership until they return and set things right in the district that excommunicated them. Not every Amish church in North America is a strict shunning church. Some Amish churches will take in people that have been disciplined by other Amish churches. But the churches that the Burkholz Amish had come from were strict shunning churches. This was a time-honored tradition. And Mullet was confident that these churches would tell his excommunicated members that they needed to go back to Burkholz. And they needed to set things right and submit themselves to Sam Mullet and his discipline. But Mullet was wrong. Word had gotten out that Mullet was excommunicating people at a very high rate, much higher rate than is typical in Amish life. So in 2006, ministers from these strict shunning churches got together to talk about what to do with Mullet and all these people that were leaving his church. There were actually 2 meetings. At these meetings, which included 300 Amish ministers from 5 different states, the ministers decided to lift strict shunning in this particular case. Not that they would overturn that general understanding of strict shunning, but in this particular case, to overturn it. And that decision completely undercut Mullet's authority over the people that had left. Because now they could go, they could leave, and they could go back into the Amish churches from which they came, which is what they wanted to do. We know that Sam Mullet was incensed by this decision made by these 300 ministers, in part because of a letter he sent to one of them, an Amish bishop named Atlee Miller. In this letter, which was really more of a drawing than a letter, Mullet assumes the role of the prophet Elijah. And there you can see him at the bottom, Prophet Elijah, i.e. Sam Mullet. That's his handwriting. And you can see the ministers at the top gathered around the altar, these prophets of Baal. Mullet assumes the role of the prophet Elijah, and he accuses them of being prophets of a false god. You can see that he's calling down fire from heaven onto the altar. And while Mullet doesn't complete the story in his drawing, if you're an Amish minister, you would know what happens at the end of that story. And that is that Elijah orders all the prophets of Baal to be killed. Now, we can be thankful that Sam Mullet didn't literally do what Elijah did. But he did get some measure of violent revenge through cutting beards and cutting hair. One of the persons who was attacked in this time was Fred Hirschberger, an elderly Amish bishop who was rousted from his sleep by Burkholt's nighttime visitors, who then held him down in a chair and cut off his beard and hair. And that is Fred Hirschberger being attacked. Hirschberger didn't know his attackers, and in his court testimony, he recalled that he had only met Sam Mullet once at an auction a long time ago. But Hirschberger was nonetheless a target because he was one of 7 of those 300 bishops. He was one of 7 whose signature showed up on a letter to Sam Mullet after the ministers' meeting, a letter telling him that his excommunications were inappropriate. Mullet was pleased to have Hirschberger humiliated in this way. And when Mullet's loyal followers reported this event to Mullet by jailhouse phone, a recording of that conversation reveals Mullet laughing uproariously as they recount the details of the attack that night. These were indeed religiously motivated crimes. And in the end, the prosecution batted nearly 100%, getting convictions against 16 men and women. Mullet was sentenced for 15 years, a rather incredible length of time in light of the fact that no one was really injured. Their hair was cut, their beards were cut, there were a few scrapes. 15 years for Sam Mullet for that. But in the aftermath of the trial, the U.S. attorney was asked about this, and he responded with a reference to his own religious identity as a Jew. And this is what he said. He said, whether it's a religiously motivated arson at the largest mosque in Toledo, or an attempt to burn down a predominantly African-American church, we have to be vigilant at protecting the freedom of each person in our society to pray and worship as they wish. The idea of people being dragged out of their beds in the middle of the night because of their religious belief and subjected to violence is something that as a Jew causes you to shudder. The fact that it could happen here in our country makes you remember how vigilant we need to be in protecting these freedoms. Dellenbach's reference to Jews may strike you as a little overstated, or at least not very analogous to what's happening here in Burkholtz. You know, this wasn't a case of German Christians or Muslim extremists trying to exterminate Jews with poison gas or with nuclear weapons. This is a few Amish people who are mad at some other Amish people. Or was it? Should Sam Mullet and his group be considered Amish? Or should they be considered something else? Perhaps formerly Amish, or breakaway Amish, or Amish-like, or an adjective. Amish-like, not a noun, Amish. This is a very complicated question, and I don't really have time to address it, but I will say this. Sam Mullet would be the first to tell you that he and his Burkholtz group were unhappy with the spiritual state of Amish communities. He would say, his lawyer has said, other people in Burkholtz have said, that they were just seeking a higher level of piety, much like Jacob Ammon. In other words, he was claiming the mantle of Jacob Ammon, this reformer years ago, from whom the Amish church derives. Other Amish people in Ohio, and probably many of you, are more likely to think of them as a cult than as a revival group of some sort, with strange practices, sexually predatory behavior by its leader, physically coercive forms of social control. These two narratives can't be more different. But in the end, the jury didn't need to sort out those details. All they needed to do to convict them of a hate crime was to establish the fact that these were violent assaults, and they considered what happened violent, and that they were religiously motivated. It didn't matter to them if they were Amish, Amish-like, sort of Amish, breakaway Amish. It was religiously motivated. What we do know is this in terms of whether they are Amish. We know that they established disciplinary rituals that are absolutely unique in Amish history. We know that Sam Mullet was ordained in a way that other Amish leaders consider entirely improper, and that it didn't involve a sufficient number of Amish bishops. We know that the group's use of physical force to tyrannize enemies violated the Amish non-resistant principle that traces back to the beginnings of Amish life. We know for a time the Amish group stopped holding Sunday morning worship services. So at the very least, we need to consider Burkholtz a very unorthodox Amish community, or a rogue Amish church, a group that retains many Amish cultural beliefs and practices, but which at least at the time of the beard cuttings had departed from significant markers in Amish life that all Amish people now and in the past would affirm. That's enough about Burkholtz. If you weren't interested in that, you can wake up. I'll talk about the Amish Mafia now. There's a lot that can be said about Amish reality television. I hardly know where to begin. More than once I've been contacted by people producing these shows. People want me to appear on screen or serve as a consultant, or perhaps more to the point, want me to find them some real-life Amish to be in the shows. Despite the fact that my boys love seeing me on TV, I've resisted those offers. I feel slimy enough just giving this presentation. Amish reality television has been around since at least 2004, when UPN aired a show called Amish in the City, in which 5 Amish young adults live in a Southern California mansion with 6 other non-Amish teens, much like MTV's Real World. The premise of this show was to enable these Amish youth to make informed choices about whether to join the church. Choice that entails a lifetime commitment and typically takes place in an Amish person's late teens or early 20s. The show's producers took the youth to various places, to the beach, to the mall, to nightclubs, to a Baptist church, to a Hindu temple, all in an attempt to open their eyes to the world they were supposedly missing down on the farm. More recently, all in the past year, there's been the National Geographic Channel's Amish Out of Order. And I'll come back to these shows before too long. TLC's Breaking Amish, which as you can see is in New York, set in New York City. And Discovery Channel's Amish Mafia. And this is a scene from that show. The question I get most frequently about these shows is, are they real? Is this stuff really true? I actually think those are good questions, and they're complicated ones. First, there's lots of different shows, there's lots of different episodes, there's lots of different scenes, there's lots of different characters. Some things are truer than others. Second, I hate to sound like President Clinton here, but we have to say whether, we have to ask, what do we mean when we say something is real? I mean, reality television is an oxymoron in and of itself. Reality, no, it's television. Come on. What exactly are we asking when we ask if made-for-television show is real? I'm going to illustrate this with a short radio clip from NPR's show On the Media. This clip aired about 4 months ago, and in it the host interviews a person who's been involved in the production of some of television's reality shows. And I hope this works. We will find out.
To understand the reality behind the unreality of reality TV, we spoke to a former producer of such fare. Alas, because he has signed ironclad confidentiality agreements, we can only speak to him under the condition that we not identify him or the shows he worked on. He says that many people outside of the industry simply do not understand how unreal reality TV is.
When I talk to people at parties, I always tell them, look, I'm going to tell you something. It may shock you for half a second, and then it will make total sense. Reality television, it's really all fake. And they're like, yeah, we can tell it's fake. And I'm like, no.
No, it's really all fake. How fake, and how long did it take you to figure that out?
I was working my first day on the show, and I was in the back seat of a rental car, and the driver and the guy in the passenger seat were both story producers for the show. And I thought, well, what a cool job. And I told him, like, look, I usually do, journalism and documentary work, and I'm super curious to work for a reality TV show. I wonder, like, how much of it is documentary and how much of it is theater. And they both started laughing, and they turned back to me and they're like, we're story producers. This is all entertainment. And they're like, okay, this family that we are shooting, we actually cut 2 of the family members out because, they weren't entertaining. And I found out they've changed people's names. If you're watching a reality TV show and you're looking around the room, maybe it's one of those shop shows. Underneath the shop counter where they're making their transaction, the director is squatting down. What? Whispering things into a little microphone. I kid you not.
Wait.
And he's shouting things like, cut, try that again, but look like this is a really hard decision. And then they said, that's great, let's get that, but we'll do it in a close-up.
I think probably everybody figured out long ago that the producers encouraged conflict between characters or contestants or whatever they are. But are you saying that they're actually intervening second by second in the taping of these shows?
Oh, yes. I mean, we give them a script. It's a loose script, but it's a script. Everyone gets one in the morning. When you show up, you get the wardrobe ready. You make sure everyone who's going to be on camera that day is prepared with what's going to be shot that day. They need to understand the conflict that you are introducing or resolving in this scene. And then you kind of coach them. Like, I realized that these directors, they're one part Little League coach and like encouraging things and then providing a little discipline when need be. And then one part amateur acting coaches where they're saying, look off into the distance when you say this. Or could you actually stand closer and maybe look down? It really projects the anger that you're feeling off.
I hate to ruin your world, your TV watching fun, but that's what education is about. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good context to keep in mind. The narratives we're watching aren't unfolding like people's lives would unfold as if the cameras weren't there. The characters we're watching are often doing things they never would have dreamed of doing had the producers not thought those ideas up. Think about your own life, for example. Unless you're Rich Stevick, the reality of your life is very boring. TV producers don't have the time to wait for something interesting to happen in your life. They need to speed it up and make it more interesting in a way that you wouldn't do it yourself. Now, you may think that's common sense, but if it is, a lot of Amish reality television viewers don't have a lot of common sense. I've been amazed at how credulous people are, including some of the journalists who have been reviewing these shows. I think recognizing the scripted nature of these shows is a good place to start. But that recognition doesn't answer all the questions about whether specific things are real. When people ask me the question whether these shows are real, I think they have some more specific questions in mind. It's really 3 different questions. First is this: are the people on the shows we're watching really Amish? Or are they just non-Amish people playing Amish people? That's one question. Second, are the roles we see people filling on these reality shows true to their identity in some way off the show? Is their persona on the show somehow match or mirror their identity off the show? And then third is this: when a show claims either through a character's voice, what a character says, or through the storyline, that the Amish do this or the Amish do that, is that true? So again, I think there are 3 different questions that are going on. Now, I'm hardly an expert on these shows. I watched 2 episodes of Amish Mafia. I fell asleep during both of them. I've watched a few snippets of Breaking Amish and a few of Amish Out of Order. I watched a lot of Amish in the City, but that's a long time ago. But just because I haven't watched these shows doesn't mean I can't get up here and tell you about them. So, that's what I'm going to do.
Are you real?
Well, that is a good question. That is a good question. But I'll start with this first question. And that is, are the people on the shows we're watching really Amish? Or are they just playing Amish? Which is a question that returns us to this issue I talked about earlier. What does it mean to be Amish? Some Amish people in that drug bust long ago said the media was missing it because these Abner and Abner hadn't joined the church. They were not really Amish. They were raised in Amish homes, but in that sense, they weren't really Amish. That's one way to think about what it means to be Amish. When you're not a church member, even if you're born into an Amish family, even if you continue to live under the roof of your Amish parents, you aren't subject to the Amish church discipline. And in the Amish world, that means you're not really Amish. But that brings us to the issue of Rumspringa. That liminal period in an Amish person's life that undergirds pretty much all of these shows. Let's say you're born into an Amish family. At some stage in your life, you need to decide whether you're going to join the church or not. And Rumspringa is that time, typically starting around age 16, when that decision is now in your court. It's also a time when you're given a little extra latitude in how you spend your time, or maybe a lot of extra latitude, depending on your family. You're increasingly spending it with peers, and in many cases with less adult supervision. Rumspringa can last for a year for some Amish kids. It can last for a decade. And like young adult life in many other North American Christian communities, that period of life takes a wide variety of forms. It can be very sedate, consisting of a few more peer-oriented activities on a Sunday afternoon or evening. Or it can be absolutely wild, like what happened in this documentary, Devil's Playground, where it was a world of drinking, drugs, sex, parties, and all sorts of things. This documentary captured the wild end of the spectrum, which of course was much more entertaining than trying to capture the much more sedate side. I think it's important to remember that Rumspringa in the Amish world is much like student life at Messiah College. In fact, college is the closest English equivalent we have to Rumspringa, a time of less parental supervision, a time to make one's decisions about life, about faith, perhaps a spouse. Now, it's hard to know what percent of Messiah College students party like there's no tomorrow during their Rumspringa. I know there are some. I know this. I know Kim Phipps wouldn't be too happy with a reality show documenting that side of Messiah College life. I also know that's what I'd like to see, on television. Okay, so back to Amish reality television. Are these young people really Amish? Well, in the sense of having born into an Amish or conservative Mennonite family in some cases, yes. As far as I can tell, almost all of the main characters that we run into are Amish in that sense. They're genetically Amish. And given their upbringing, they carry with them many Amish cultural habits and traits. But in the sense of being Amish church members, no. None of the primary people in these shows are Amish in the sense of being Amish church members. Some of them may have been members. Occasionally we'll run into one that may have been a member at some point. But if so, if they're on this show in a major way, they have left. In fact, many of the people on these shows are very distant from their families and from their churches. Many of them have basically decided that they will never join the Amish church of their parents. I mean, in a sense, they're on Rumspringa, but they are now beyond Rumspringa. In some cases, they're nearly 2 generations removed from their conservative Anabaptist churches. For instance, one of the women in Breaking Amish claims to be from a conservative Mennonite background. And that's true, though her parents left their black bumper Mennonite church when she was a toddler, and they never returned. Still, she can trade on her conservative Mennonite background because she has many relatives in the conservative Mennonite world that speak Pennsylvania Dutch, live a conservative Mennonite lifestyle. She knows that world well enough to act it out on a reality show with maybe a little coaching from her producers. One final observation on this question: are these reality show characters really Amish? Joe Springer is a researcher at Goshen College. He's made it his hobby. Some people think it's an obsession to trace the family backgrounds of people in these shows. One of the things he's discovered is that quite a few of the Amish reality television stars were adopted as infants or children into Amish or conservative Mennonite homes. Interestingly enough, this is a main plot line in many of the Amish romance novels that fill the shelves of Christian bookstores. The Amish female protagonist discovers that she was adopted as a child and therefore is not genetically linked to her parents or to the community that she's a part of. In Amish romance novels, the endings are usually very happy and very pious as she discovers her true identity. But I think in real life, the endings are often much less happy. And I imagine the Amish or Mennonite parents who hear that their adoptive children are breaking Amish are actually brokenhearted. I'd be interested to see a study, and I don't know who would be able to do this, to study children who are adopted into conservative Amish and Mennonite families to see really what their trajectory is. There have been studies of other cross-cultural adoptions. I would think this is at least as hard to make it work, and maybe harder. So again, that's the question. Are these characters really Amish? My answer depends what you mean by Amish. If you mean being born and baptized into an Amish family, being adopted into an Amish family, having Amish aunts, Amish uncles, yes, I think most of them are Amish. Being church members, no. Second question, are the roles we see people filling on reality shows true to life? That is, do their television personas match their identities outside of the camera's eyes? Once again, I'll have to answer that question. It depends. In my estimation, the National Geographic show Amish Out of Order is the truest to life in this way. That is, in terms of the on-screen personas of the characters mirroring their identities and social locations in real life. This slide provides the show's premise, an unprecedented glimpse into the world of the ex-Amish, no longer welcome at home, trying to find their place in an unfamiliar and dangerous new world. From what I could tell, and I didn't watch much of this show, but from what I can tell, the show's producers are not giving people new personas to act out. They're not taking them to strange and exotic places to see what their reactions are going to be. Rather, they're allowing these men and women to more or less be themselves. Now, yes, it's likely being scripted. There are likely very dramatic elements being added to make things more interesting. But I think, again, they're largely playing themselves on screen. In that sense, Amish Out of Order is much closer to a documentary film than Breaking Amish or the Amish Mafia. Like Amish Out of Order, Breaking Amish claims to be following young men and young women who are moving away from their Amish or Mennonite past toward a non-Amish future. But there are profound differences. First, the people on Breaking Amish are much further removed from their Amish past. In many cases, a decade or more removed from a plain Amish or Mennonite past. Second, the characters appear to be willing to have their lives shaped in any way that their producers, whose only goal is to attract a wide viewership, any way the producers want them to be shaped. Which means that Breaking Amish, in my view, breaks all the records for sleaze in Amish reality shows. The show unfolds in New York City, where the characters occasionally are shown in Amish garb, but seem just as happy to strip off their clothes as to wear Amish garb. The show's characters, in my opinion, are much less Amish youth breaking Amish than they are fame-seeking young people with Amish relatives. So unlike Amish Out of Order, in Breaking Amish, the character's Amishness to me almost seems beside the point. They're just putting these relatively simple and naive young people into dramatic and sometimes sleazy situations. What about Amish Mafia? I won't spend much time on this. I think it's pretty obvious. There's no such thing as an Amish Mafia. So no, Lebanon Levi is not an Amish mafioso. If you're not convinced of this, you should have come along with me on Sunday to the Fredericksburg Public Library in Lebanon County. As a fundraiser, the library arranged for a meet and greet with Levi Stoltzfus, who plays Lebanon Levi on the Amish Mafia. I paid $10 for a ticket, but I wasn't sure about wasting my Sunday afternoon. So I emailed the library to find out what the afternoon would entail. And this is the email I got back from the librarian. I guess this is what librarians need to do to get people in libraries these days. I mean, I need to talk to Jonathan Lauer about this. Maybe this will work in the SIA. She wrote this: Levi will be arriving in character and in the Cadillac. He will be escorted into our building by security. I and another library staff member will ask him questions for a few minutes. All of our questions will come from the scripts of the TV show, and Levi will know what the questions are ahead of time. And then this last line is the best. We will be welcoming Lebanon Levi, the TV personality, rather than Levi Stoltzfus, the construction contractor. So as you can see, the real Levi Stoltzfus is a construction contractor, a very famous one, whose father was indeed Amish. Father died a long time ago. He's been removed from the, Levi's been away from the church as a member for a long time. He's a famous contractor, but thanks to this show, and people don't know he's a contractor, they think he's an Amish mafioso. But he's not. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been brave enough to get my picture taken with him. So, there I am, hanging out with Lebanon Levi. You can see that they had a motorcycle gang there to protect him. I think, because the first question was, where is Mervyn, which is the guy from Ohio that I think is trying to take over, his realm. And so they wanted to search me when I walked in, to make sure I didn't have any weapons. And they didn't do that very well, but anyway. Okay, the third question then. When the show claims, either through a character's voice or through the storyline, that the Amish do this or that, is that true? And I have an easy answer to that, but again, a very unsatisfying answer. I'm sure it depends what you mean by this or that. Each of these shows is making many claims about what the Amish do, or about what the Amish don't do, or about what some Amish do. And I think many of these claims are true. So for instance, when a show films Amish teens at an alcohol-fueled party, and there are some scenes of this in the Amish Mafia, that's a true-to-life experience for some Amish kids in some settlements. And as far as I could tell, and I could be wrong about this, some of those parties that are on film in the Amish Mafia are actual parties that a camera has gone to and is filming. They're not staged. There are Amish kids at these parties drinking a lot more than they should. But there are other things on these shows that I'm very skeptical of or know to be untrue. I've already talked about, the existence of an Amish Mafia and non-existence. In the last episode of Amish Mafia, two characters performed what they called a cleansing ceremony, a sort of exorcism of a demon-possessed Amish acquaintance, replete with candles and I think it was Bible readings, although it might have been prayers. It's hard to say never when it comes to the Amish because there's a long history and thousands of different districts and a lot of variety. But I can say I've never heard of such a thing. So if it does exist, it is very, very uncommon. Again, Amish Mafia, the rival factions, sanctioned by the church, working outside the law, that's all a fabrication. Now, the Amish do take care of their own, but not in that way. If Amish people feel violated by outsiders, which is a premise of this show, they don't always go to the police, but they do go to the police when a violation is violent. This is even true when the violence comes from within the Amish world. For instance, when Bishop Hirschberger was attacked by the Burkholz beard cutters, he didn't call the Amish Mafia. He called the police. Not quickly. He waited till the next day, and not happily, but he did. And when pressed by defense attorneys who accused him on the stand of departing from Amish practice by calling the police and going outside the community for help, Bishop Hirschberger simply said he wanted to make sure no one else in his community would be attacked. Plus, he said, the attackers themselves, and these were his words, needed help. In other words, the Burkholz attackers needed help from the police to stop doing what they were doing. They couldn't stop themselves. And Hirschberger's community couldn't stop them. They needed the police to stop them. So again, back to the question. If something's portrayed as an Amish practice in these shows, it may or may not be the case. I wish it was more clear-cut than that. It's not. My best advice is simply this. Don't take these shows as your primary source of knowledge about Amish life. You should watch the PBS video documentary, The Amish. Or if you're interested in Amish youth, Rich Stevick will sell you an old edition of his book or the new one when it comes out. The best way to understand what happens with Amish youth in real life. Or you could buy one of my books. Doing that will give me a few royalties, and it will keep me from selling out the next time a reality show producer wants to pay me to be a consultant. So, thank you for your attention. We have a little time.